All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you for coming today. Today is on the third day, but the second of our T speaker series on re-emerging refugees. Last week, we had Dr. Gabriel Pisciotti, and I hope you all enjoyed that talk. Dr. Pisciotti sure did. Okay. And we had a lot of virtual attendance as well, with a couple of questions, almost 20 people, and same here. Now, I already mentioned we structured the lecture series so that it complements our course content. The course content, since we are looking into overarching refugee epistemology and how they are developing, so each of our three guest speakers focus on how refugees produce or reimagine knowledge and reinvent themselves from a specific angle. And this is important, like you mentioned, because your final paper, which I'll introduce on Thursday, but I ask you to connect the course learning to your major in some way. So Dr. Gabriel Pisciotti approached the refugee content from a literary angle with the dictee and how does words challenge our understanding of different things. Today's lecture by Mohammad Zaki Rezwan will focus refugee knowledge and epistemology from visual, culture, and media, with a bit of art work as well. And our third speaker will approach the refugee knowledge from a social work policy angle. So each of these three things shows how refugee knowledge so far produced by a different body who have not have been the lived experience and who have produced or stereotyped refugees in some way is actually counterproductive. Now, I've known Mohammad Zaki. I've known Dr. Gabriel Pisciotti for about 6 years. Unfortunately, I've known Mohammad Zaki for more than 10 years. He and I collaborate on a lot of projects on grants. He is one of the most talented person I know who does work behind Spotlight. He built some archive of rickshaw art, which is globally acknowledged, and doing some crucial work in preserving art history of different things. Another key aspect is that he's very hardworking, but also definitely on the top 3 most annoying person I ever had the chance to meet and know. But he's a very good scholar on that. So Dr. Mohammad Zaki works for BRAC University in Bangladesh. He's a senior lecturer there. He received his MA in comparative media from Simon Fraser University and has almost 10 years of experience working both in academia and developing public-facing projects to highlight artwork and especially refugee knowledge production. So he's a very valuable resource person. He came to San Francisco, and then I conned him into coming to the East Coast and delivering this lecture in person. He's not very happy about it, but he is happy now as he's come to this class to deliver this lecture. So without much ado, Zaki, the floor is all yours. And if you have any question, we'll come at the end of the session.
Right. Thank you, Tati, for that not so untrue introduction. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Mohammad Zaki Rezwan, and I go by Zaki, and I teach visual art and culture at BRAC University. Before I begin the talk, I just wanted to mention how I've structured all the discussions. I may be able to ask a few questions. Feel free to join in, or if you don't have any contextual knowledge, it's also fine. All right. So what we're going to do, because it's highly possible that you might not be able to have adequate knowledge about the topic that we're discussing, I'll try to talk about the background a bit more than I think what would be enough, so that we can at least situate our discussion and move forward then from there. And then I will be talking about one of the particular refugee communities in the world right now. And then I'll just start discussing about the core topic of my research. All right. Starting with perhaps maybe something that you might have heard of, you might have also seen. I have actually seen something quite similar in the NY. So you have heard about rickshaws, three-wheeler vehicles, which is actually really quite common and popular in South Asia, especially in Bangladesh and some parts of India. And as far as I can remember, perhaps maybe in other parts of South Asia, right? So what you'll notice, especially because I'm referring to mostly Bangladeshi rickshaw, what you'll notice in Bangladeshi rickshaw, yes, it's obviously meant for transport, but you'll also get a lot of visuals going on all around the rickshaws, like all these decorative things that you'll notice on the rickshaw they're usually painted or crafted by someone who we call actually rickshaw painters or rickshaw artists. All right. And these paintings or artworks that you see, they're not necessarily just quite similar, like, or the pattern may be a bit similar, but you would notice a diverse range of topics being explored in rickshaw paintings. And ideally, there will be at least one backboard painted using expressions like that. So, and as you can notice from all these paintings, these do tell a lot about different aspects of life or experience in Bangladesh. All right. And I can't really actually list all the topics because this practice is in use perhaps maybe for it's been or maybe somewhere around 50 years. So, but ideally you'll see a lot of references to floral motifs or maybe even rural or village lifestyles. It can be even a thematic spectacle, or perhaps maybe something to do with animal fables. These are some of the common contents or stories you will find in rickshaw painting. Let's move to perhaps maybe why rickshaw art in Bangladesh could be a bit unique and could be a different experience that you'd gather maybe in other continents or in other parts of the world. So rickshaw, because it's a vehicle and it's used by people to commute from one place to another, all right? And I must tell you, the fare is really quite cheap, obviously because of the economy there, but it's actually really quite convenient. It does actually ruin our physical health because we no longer want to walk. But for example, maybe less than $1 for a mile of commute, or maybe for 2 miles commute. And so rickshaws, as it has paintings all over its body, it becomes a moving exhibition. Moving meaning that because it moves from one street to another, so it takes the painting with itself, and the visuals are actually all over the rickshaw body. And what happens ideally, because imagine yourself as perhaps maybe a passerby in Dhaka in Bangladesh or any other parts of Bangladesh, and you are encountering rickshaw on the streets of any urban space in Bangladesh, right? And these rickshaws will actually contribute to your unique urban experience. Like, for example, if you have been to any towns in the US, you have probably, I'm not sure, maybe different urban experience. At least that's something that I encountered. Like, my visit in San Francisco is actually really quite different than what I'm experiencing here. And for Bangladesh, rickshaw will be actually an integral part of your urban experience. And what is really that urban experience? Like, if you take a look at the historical aspects of rickshaw painting, you will realize that the artists of rickshaw paintings, they're actually quite carefully documenting the history of Bangladesh, not necessarily only the political history of Bangladesh. Consider these paintings also more like and a personal expression of the encounter or the experience of the artist. Like, these artists that I'm talking about, I didn't really bring it here today, but they are ideally not, like, they're usually not really from a convenient position in terms of their social class. Like, they're mostly actually making money, like their livelihood based on the amount of painting they are actually making. And oftentimes it's not really that much, perhaps maybe $3 to $5 for each one of the paintings. So one would have to actually really work hard every day or for the entire year to at least like support his or her family. So, and with all these paintings and throughout these moving exhibitions, what you're looking at is actually paintings or expressions or contributions of this artist visual expression. And these exhibitions can also become an alternative exhibition or an alternative to the institutional exhibition, because we are kind of used to visiting experience at an art gallery or perhaps maybe at museums, right? And these exhibitions can actually counter the dominance of those artistic or the institutional exhibitions. All right. So that's the reason I actually find rickshaw art really quite politically interesting. And of course, by studying the contents of rickshaw art, I've also noticed that like the artists are, because most of them are actually underprivileged, they don't really have equal access to welfare, money, or perhaps maybe luxury. These paintings become their ways to at least raise their voice, or at least tell the world, tell the people on the street that they are doing something. Their voices do actually matter. Jumping to a different background for my research, because I kind of, for this particular topic, I'm focusing on some of the artistic practices done by the Rohingya people. Just wanted to know if you have any prior knowledge about the Rohingya people. Any idea? Anyone have heard about Rohingya people or the Rohingyas? So Rohingyas are actually from the Rakhine state of Burma, and who are currently, I'm not saying that most of them actually migrated from Burma to Bangladesh, but a large part of them are actually currently residing in Bangladesh under this refugee status, right? And of course, there's a reason for their migration. There's a reason for they had to actually move, is actually the military crackdown by the Burmese government, Burmese military government in 2016. And because of that genocide, and of course, it does make sense because you could actually stay in your land, have this have control, control over the land, but you would have to also save your life. And migrating or movements became actually the only way for them to at least have some control over their own life. So the Rohingyas, because of that military crackdown, they decided, a large portion of them, and still is happening, decided to actually move to Bangladesh, like the neighboring country of Myanmar. And right now in Bangladesh, we do actually have a lot of Rohingya refugees living in some parts of Bangladesh, mostly the bordering nations, bordering areas of Myanmar. The picture I have in front of you is actually more like, it will give you an idea of what is really happening in Myanmar. The one on the left that you're looking at is actually what happened before the military crackdown. All right, so you're looking at perhaps more like a Rohingya village, like where they would actually have their normal day-to-day life. And the second one you can see is actually the aftermath of the military crackdown, or the violence or the distractions. And it's clear that the houses, or even the nature, or any resources that one could actually have up there, they are no longer actually in place. So, and when you don't have home, and this is actually one important thing, I think you are probably studying this semester with the course that you're taking, right? Like the idea of home, what you can call as something truly yours, or maybe even the idea of belongingness. And this is an image that I found really quite depressing, because it tells you about the long march of Rohingyas from their own land to Bangladesh. Like, this is what you're looking at, is actually their transformation from being a Burmese citizen to just a refugee in Bangladesh, right? Okay, so this is 2024, and what I'm referring to happened in 2016, but the crisis did not really stop. One reason is there haven't been any true political stabilities in Myanmar, and the second reason is because we are dealing with refugees, and because the life of the refugees, it does not really actually stop at that point. Like, that crisis continues. All right, and right now in Bangladesh, we do actually have two refugee camps. One of them is in Ukhia, Cox's Bazar, and the landscape is actually really quite interesting, because it's actually somewhere around the hills. Like, the Rohingyas are digging up the hills, they're making their own houses, just so that they can actually have some sort of living. The second one we have right now is actually really quite recent. As far as I can remember, it's probably the government took an initiative to start this camp in 2020. So this one is called the Bhashanchar refugee camp. It's on an island, and as you can clearly see, this one is a bit structured. Like the last one, it was something like the Ukhia one, it was something born out of that initial moment of military crackdown. And this one is designed by the government of Bangladesh, where they can actually relocate the Rohingyas from the other parts of Bangladesh to a much more, I'm not going to use the word secured, more controlled space, more structured space. All right. Just to perhaps maybe like illustrate about the lifestyle of the Rohingyas as a refugee, there are several interesting changes that one could easily notice because of that life of because of that refugeeship. It could and of course because the Rohingyas are now no longer living in a country they would call their home, or they would call as their state. There would be obviously a lot of restrictions or barriers in Bangladesh. All right. And some of the interesting ones that I've noticed, one of them was actually regarding the idea of governance. Because the Rohingyas are no longer living in the Myanmar, so you could actually consider them stateless. And when they were under a particular state, for example, Myanmar, they could actually be governed by all the state's law, regulations, or ideologies. And because of the refugee, they are no longer part of all these ideologies or the laws or regulations that one would find in Myanmar. And here in this stateless position, they're practically actually free. So, and interestingly, during their refugee, what became really quite important and prominent way of life for the Rohingyas is actually the religious scriptures or the laws or the regulations or the philosophy of the religion that they started following extensively. And that happened obviously in the absence of any kind of political governance during the refugee. Another interesting changes that one would notice is perhaps maybe in terms of the education. So the Rohingyas are not really allowed to have mainstream education in Bangladesh. So they can't really get into any mainstream schools, college, or universities. All right. And what happens because of that? Because the kids would need to actually study something or learn something. So in the absence of those mainstream educations, we started looking at the growing trend of religious educations. Institutions like madrasa became really quite popular, and not only popular, became perhaps maybe one of the few options left for the Rohingyas in Bangladesh or in those refugee camps. All right. So more some other interesting aspects that one will notice in those refugee camp would be perhaps some sort of DIY, do-it-yourself culture, which I would actually perhaps maybe find quite similar to the Jugaad venture. It's an I'm borrowing from India. What it means is that you are actually trying to find a way to to make an effective solution to the problem that you have, not necessarily based on whatever you can actually find, rather based on what you have already available to yourself. So that's Jugaad, and Jugaad economy is really quite popular in South Asia, in Bangladesh, or even in India. And ideally, you will find a lot of people relying on all these ready-made materials to find a way make money or to find a livelihood. And for Rohingyas, because these camps, they do not actually have a lot of resources in their camps. And of course, Jugaad would become actually an essential source or technique for them to have some sort of livelihood. So in terms of economy or financial ventures, I did notice a lot of Jugaad ventures, even in terms of mechanical ventures or manufacturing units. I did notice a lot of DIY techniques or approaches done by the Rohingyas. For example, it's really quite interesting because I have never really thought about encountering that. So these Rohingyas, these refugees, they would get a lot of aids by the UNHCR or any other international organizations, right? They would usually get a lot of aid or donations or some sort of support just so that their pain or suffering can be eased. So I noticed it was somewhere around the market of one of the refugee camps. So the shopkeepers, the Rohingya shopkeeper was actually selling a box of painting donated by UN. And that store had a lot of different objects given to the Rohingyas by these organizations, international organizations. And I'm not saying that perhaps maybe the Rohingyas have no use of them. What I realized is that they've wanted to actually find a better way to make use of those objects they have received as donation or as aid. That's just one example of like different alternative economic institution that we could find in these refugee camps. And through these Jugaad ventures, I would say that these are the ways the Rohingyas are actually offering some sort of resilience, and also they're hoping to actually sustain throughout their days there in the refugee camp. Let's talk about art and visual culture, because and it doesn't really mean that because they are refugee, they are not part of any kind of artistic venture. Not recently, perhaps maybe for the last couple of years, international organizations, including even artistic centers or institutions, they are continuously collaborating in these refugee camps to come up with projects that would allow the Rohingyas to also express themselves creatively and also perhaps maybe focus on the cultural root. Right. Some examples would include perhaps maybe this articulation project in collaboration with UNHCR. What you're looking at is actually more like a performative gesture. Articulation would they also had murals, some of the really quite interesting murals that I've seen in the Ukiah camp. These murals would have stories or perhaps maybe the visual experience of refugee life or perhaps even the root of the Rohingya people. I have seen even graffiti projects. What you're looking at is actually like graffitis done on the walls of the bathroom, any wall that you'll find in this refugee camp, especially the one in Ukiah, you'll actually find a lot of ways these organizations are trying to actually help Rohingyas to express themselves visually on the walls, or it could be even with performance. The most important, and perhaps because somehow I consider that the most strongest one would be actually Rohingya Cultural Memory Center. So it's more like a center built for preserving or storing any kind of cultural memory the Rohingya people had, maybe right now or even earlier. So what this center does, it tries to accommodate, it tries to display, store, and preserve all these are creative ventures that Rohingyas can do or Rohingyas like have been doing earlier or for a very long time. And this memory center would have a lot of objects, crafts, or artistic projects, a lot of things, anything that the Rohingyas can make, you'll actually find there a lot. And so, as the name suggests, because it's all about the cultural memory, and because of that refugee life, it's highly possible that one way or another, you may not be able to actually store or preserve your cultural root. And this attempt is actually a great example to find a way to have more like a preservation for these Rohingya cultures. So if we take a look at all these projects that I've been talking about, the artistic or visual projects, these are really quite important. Obviously, it makes sense because they allow the preservation of Rohingya culture, and also with that preservation, they do also help with people to identify the impact of genocide or conflict, because these are made specially after Rohingyas have moved to Bangladesh, right? And in these projects, one could clearly see the sense of belongingness, or perhaps maybe the nostalgia tone could be easily identified in these projects. And one common attitude that I've noticed in these projects would be actually in many cases, the Rohingyas are sharing their nostalgia with each other. They're like these projects help them take a look back at their root. These projects help them also to find a way to sustain where they're right now currently, to at least prepare themselves to have some strong establishment there in Bangladesh. And interestingly, what I also noticed, most of the stories that you'll find here in these projects, they do mostly focus on the narrative of loss or resilience. All right. And I did not really find quite like any story that would actually tell us about what's really new or what's changing, or perhaps maybe the story of creation. That's something that I really considered that I found really quite interesting, because I wanted to really work on that part. Like, because and we do talk a lot about how the refugees are like the eraser of refugee memories, or the eraser of the cultural memory of the refugees. But for this particular one, I wanted to actually understand like what from now, like where are we moving forward, like what is our intention for the days coming ahead. And that's where I'm situating my research. So let's talk about Rohingya rickshaws, like a really quite new phenomenon. Something we have been talking about rickshaws. They are mostly Bangladeshi rickshaws, all right? And something that I've noticed started emerging for the last couple of years is actually in Bhashanchor camp, one of the new camps where I started seeing the development of rickshaws, like these three-wheeler vehicles. And it's really interesting because I haven't seen any kind of rickshaws in the previous camp. And right now in Bhashanchor camp on that island, there are around actually 300 rickshaws currently. That's the figure I have from the data collection last month. And the reason why the Rohingyas have all these rickshaws there is obviously for transport or commute. Like the people, the Rohingya people, they would want to go from one part of the camp. The camp is really quite huge. Like it takes actually sometimes even an hour. Or that's the reason we have all these transportations that would actually ease the commute problem or the commute suffering. And interestingly, these rickshaws that we're talking about, they are manufactured locally by the Rohingyas, and not just like proper, strong, established manufacturing process. We're looking at DIY manufacturing process, like Jugaad manufacturing process. Like it's not necessarily that Rohingyas they are going to actually have established manufacturing unit, rather they're relying on whatever that are available to them. For example, if you take a look at this, one of the rickshaws of Rohingyas, you'll find different parts taken from not necessarily from the same production unit, or it can be actually the suspension that could be used in cycles, or the wheels, it can be from some other vehicles, and even all these wooden platforms that you're looking here, where a passenger would actually sit, they are made entirely by the Rohingyas. But these wooden platforms, they were never really actually in concrete shape. The entire thing is designed or formulated by the Rohingyas. So I wanted to know, when I noticed these rickshaws, I wanted to know like how these people, like how the Rohingyas could come up with this particular design. And then I wanted to find out like what they were actually doing, or what does it look like in Myanmar? Like what does their rickshaw look like? And I found out it's actually really quite entirely different than what I have noticed in the Bhashanchar camp. All right. Like here, I think you can clearly see the difference here, right? The seating arrangement, or perhaps maybe even the use of suspension, everything looks a bit different, and the riding experience would definitely be different. And of course, I don't see any kind of flat surfaces here. It's just the seating platform. That's it. Like no visual experience like the one we have in Bangladesh is absolutely practical. I would say it's absolutely really quite pragmatic. All right. So with these rickshaws, what was happening, and what I would actually claim that so what the Rohingyas are doing with all this development or manufacturing of rickshaws, the people who are in charge of making these rickshaws, they are never really actually truly rickshaw mechanics or rickshaw manufacturers. These people, these Rohingya people who are making these rickshaws, they were actually once a car mechanic or even carpenter, like something different in their previous life in Myanmar. Like and I've asked around, and some of them are actually they were not even related to any kind of vehicle maintenance or vehicle production, right? But interestingly, these people during their refugee life, they have become like manufacturer of a vehicle that they probably never really had in the same way in Myanmar. All right. So what I would actually suggest that these mechanics, these manufacturer, they're actually bringing the memory of their craftsmanship or the skills they gathered from in Myanmar, and they're taking also that during their migration, during their movement, they're also actually carrying these skills with them. And that's the only reason they could actually find a way to implement those skills in real life production. So the image that you see here in front of you is actually a photo of mechanic Hafizullah from Mondu. He is actually one of the most famous or influential manufacturer of rickshaw in Bhashanchar camp. The stories I heard is actually that he is one of the founding figures of rickshaws in Bhashanchar. Like he's the one who came up with this particular design. But where does it stand different than Bangladeshi rickshaw? Because I think earlier in today's talk, I did actually give you an impression of what rickshaws would look like in Bangladesh, right? And it's clearly that these rickshaws, they do look a bit different, quite a bit similar, but there are several similar differences when it comes to the design. When I was talking to the Rohingya manufacturers of rickshaws, they were telling me how in the design, how the design of the rickshaw is actually changed, or how they relied on the weather of Bhashanchar. The weather in Bhashanchar is really quite unstable. It's really quite windy, like the one that we are having today here in Hartford. And it's so much windy that imagine rickshaw, it would actually work like a parachute. So if you don't really have a strong rickshaw, it's not going to be easy for one to pedal the rickshaw or take it actually forward. Like it could be blown away by strong wind. So that's the reason the manufacturers, they come up with a really quite strong design. And they are also claiming that the suspension is really quite great. They are focusing on suspensions too, because so that the passengers can get some sort of comfort. And the purpose is really quite different than what one would find in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, in ideally, usually in Bangladesh, the rickshaws would be mostly for private commute or private transportation, almost like taxi, right? But in Bhasanchar, these rickshaws are used both for private and also for public transportation. Like you could actually fit at least six of them in these Bhasanchar rickshaws, but not necessarily in the rickshaws in Bangladesh. You could only fit probably two. Three would be a bit difficult, right? So these are the information, these are the comparisons that one will find if you actually take a look at both of the rickshaws, all right? And that's just another design. This one looks even more roomy, because can you really see that other seating arrangement right on the top of the wheel? So you could actually even put someone also on the top of the wheel, right? So inside you can probably fit in six, and maybe on both of the sides of the wheel, you can probably make two people sit in that rickshaw. So where does the art come from? Like, when do we start talking about Rohingya rickshaw art? And when I was actually looking at all these rickshaws, I was really quite surprised to see that like they are not just transportations, like they are not just for people to move from one place to another. I was really surprised to see that these rickshaws came with almost something similar to what I have encountered in Bangladeshi rickshaws. Like they are coming, these rickshaws are also with some sort of artistic or creative designs. They can be actually really quite objective. They can be not similar to Bangladeshi ones, but I started looking at some creative expressions incorporated in the rickshaws of Bhasanchar. So, and that's something that I noticed, because when I was looking at the use of the designs or the use of the textile or the use of actually the flat surface on all the board on all sides of these rickshaws, that's when I found some creative attempts done by the manufacturers. So I would actually see it as perhaps maybe the early days of Rohingya rickshaw art, something that happened in Bangladesh maybe 50 or 60 years ago. So these Rohingya rickshaw art that we are talking about, they're actually also just like rickshaws in Bhasanchar. They're actually based on the limited resource the manufacturer or the craftsman can actually accommodate. Like most of the materials that you'll find on the in the use, they're found materials, meaning that nothing is actually really customized. It's absolutely based on what the craftsman could actually find on the street, was available on the shops in the Bhasanchar camp. And oftentimes they would have to rely on whatever the products they can buy from Bangladeshi vendor. So, and it's also really quite limited. And again, like what we're looking at, these rickshaw mechanics, they are not necessarily only building the rickshaw or manufacturing the rickshaw. They are also they are also being in charge of the design of the rickshaw. So earlier when we were talking about these Rohingya rickshaws, where the car mechanics or carpenters were turning into the developer or manufacturer of rickshaws, here in this particular creative expression, these mechanics are also turning into artists or Rohingya rickshaw artists. Let's talk about perhaps maybe some of the common aesthetic qualities that one will be able to identify in these rickshaws. There is a really interesting story that I've heard when I was asking around about the source of inspiration, like what actually helped you to come up with designs like that. And I heard a story of a shipwreck somewhere near the Bhasanchar camp. And during that shipwreck, the Rohingyas were able to find a lot of materials that started actually rising from that shipwreck. So they were collecting everything that's left over from the shipwreck, and they could actually find a lot of materials like plastic, resins, or even textiles they could actually use for these rickshaws. And because and I guess you can perhaps maybe pretty much imagine now anything will actually work in those refugee camps. They started thinking of how they can actually use those source materials. All right. So, and some of the materials they gathered from the shipwreck, they salvaged from the shipwreck, they were actually full of floral motifs. They were full of flowers. And they started actually thinking about using or incorporating them more in whatever they were actually making that time, the rickshaws. And that's the reason in many of these rickshaws, you'll find the use of blooming flowers or even floral motif. Like at least on the back of these rickshaws. All right. I think on the right, what you can see is perhaps maybe one, two, three, four lines or 4 rows of floral flowers, blooming flowers. They do actually look closely. I could not really identify them. It's really quite distinctive. I can't really actually relate it to any existing species, but they do actually look like rose to me. All right. On the left one, I think you can easily clearly see perhaps maybe 4 or 5 different roses on top. So floral and flower motifs, they're really quite popular in Rohingya rickshaws. Not only that, you'd also find really quite interesting use of textile or resin or plastic sheets on top of these rickshaws. Like I think the left one has something blue and the right one has something really quite like black, like dark red. And these textures, this is not something that Rohingyas are making. Like they're not drawing it. They're just trying to find something based on whatever that's available to them. All right. So that's the process of selection. That's the process of curation for them. Like what should go, what should not go. These are the choices made by these manufacturers. All right. And oftentimes, and this happens a lot right now because manufacturers are getting a lot of requests to make more rickshaws. The person who would want the manufacturer to make a rickshaw, like all this commissioning of these rickshaws, would also have some requests for specific design pattern. What I've heard is actually buyers would request the manufacturer to put some more flowers. Why? Because it would actually make them feel good, or it would actually make them feel really quite beautiful. So that's the idea of it. All right. So I just wanted to ask these questions just so that I can know why suddenly we have rickshaws on the Vashanchar Island, like, and why only in this refugee camp? Because we have several other camps, refugee camps in Bangladesh, but in nowhere I could actually find the development of rickshaw or rickshaw art or rickshaw craftsmanship. All right. And of course, like if I take a look back, like why Rohingyas are making something now, making something like that now? Why not before their refugee life? All right. Another question that I kept asking is actually like why we didn't really have rickshaws like that or creative ventures like that in the previous refugee camp, from where Rohingyas were relocated to the new camp. And when I was asking this question, I wanted to actually see how they are different or similar to the ones that we have in Bangladesh. So even in Bangladeshi rickshaw art, one would clearly see or notice the use of floral or flower motifs. Like it's actually really quite popular motif or like popular pattern one would easily notice in Bangladeshi rickshaws. And oftentimes during the early days of, even though rickshaw art in Bangladesh started with floral motif, the artists started finding new potentials in different topics or different stories. So maybe even if it started with something really quite simple like that, but they started expanding to different territories, different contents, different experiences of their life. But ideally, all of these works, they do actually express the vernacular language of the painter, of the artist. And these vernacular language, they are not really fashioned or modeled or schooled by any high institution. Like these are mostly representing whatever the experience, limited experience the painter has or the painter could actually gather in his small life. And of course, these flowers or these designs that you see there is no established school of thought for that. Like it's just DIY knowledge that the painters are using or the mechanics are using to decorate the entire rickshaw. And another important thing that I also found out when I was looking at rickshaw painting, Bangladeshi rickshaw painting, the artists, even including the mechanics, they went through urban migration. They went to urban migration, meaning most of them were living in the rural areas. And after they were pursuing something better in their life, they moved to the urban part in Bangladesh. And during their urban status or during their urban life, they started seeking different livelihoods or different creative ventures to support or to sustain their life. And rickshaw became really quite an important medium for these migrated artists in Bangladesh to at least have some sort of voice. And of course, the same knowledge, I think I did mention that before, these rickshaws allowed these artists to have some sort of counter exhibition, some sort of alternative method they could use to challenge the norm or to challenge the high power or the ruling power. So I do believe, and based on the interviews, based on the encounter, based on the data that I had in my field work, is these rickshaws that I would find, these rickshaws I found out on the Vashanchar Island, they are actually based on the intercultural encounter the Rohingyas had with Bangladeshi people. And so you could actually consider the Rohingya rickshaws as more like a method for Rohingya people to have some sort of appreciation for the Bangladeshi culture. And with all these changes that I've noticed in Rohingya rickshaw art, I could also see how they were interpreting rickshaw culture and rickshaw art in their own way. And they're using their own knowledge to change the way they would actually see, they would actually set up their own artistic venture, even though the limited resource, despite the limited resource they have, is also really quite clearly evident that these mechanics or manufacturers or artists, they're trying to exactly function like the way the rickshaw artists are functioning. And so I could actually ask questions like, these Rohingya rickshaw art, or whatever the condition it is currently in right now, can you really call it a hybrid culture? A culture that is born out of the interaction it had with the host country. We don't have to seek answer to that. It's a question that I'm actually still also asking. There are several differences between rickshaw art, Bangladeshi rickshaw art and Rohingya rickshaw art, is perhaps because the choice of expressions, obviously, and the choice of floral motif. I would actually claim that the Rohingya rickshaw art still is in its early phase, is still being developed. It has a long way to go. For Bangladeshi rickshaw art, it took probably 60, 70 years. And I could see how in perhaps maybe in few more decades, the Rohingya one will be a bit more developed. And of course, the artist will try to find different ways to talk about their experiences. All right, it's just the beginning with flowers or with all these textiles that you will notice. It will be expanded to different territories. So the entire project, the entire creative venture that we have, I would actually see how the Rohingya people, at least these manufacturers or mechanics, how, because of the displacement, of course, it's possible they're displaced and they're actually looking to find a way to be connected to their belongingness, or to be connected to their root, or to be connected to their home. And in this particular case, I would say that the rickshaw manufacturers, or the Rohingya rickshaw manufacturers or mechanics, they're trying to find or seek a new identity. An identity that's heavily based on, not necessarily, not entirely based on the root, their cultural root, but also based on the encounter they have with the host country or with the culture of the host country. And these rickshaws are becoming an archive in motion, of course, obviously within the boundary of these refugee camps. And these rickshaws would actually definitely be part of the encounter of all these people. They are living in the refugee camps. And of course, these rickshaws will actually carry the artistic ventures of all these mechanics, or creative ventures of these mechanics. And of course, at one point in the future, and even now, I think these rickshaw arts, all these decorations, they are already documenting the legacy, or perhaps maybe the impact of genocide that Rohingya people had experienced. So that's everything that I had to share. And I hope that perhaps maybe, of course, I know that there will be a lot of questions, or at least you would like to know more about the contextual information about the Rohingya art. I'd be happy to actually answer, or at least try to perhaps maybe guide you to the answers, guide you to some more discussions related to that will clarify our understanding of Rohingya rickshaw art or Rohingya community. And I would like to actually thank Mr. Mizanur Rahman, one of the Rohingya photographers who I worked with for my data collection. And without his help, it wasn't going to be possible for me to actually at least do this. So yeah, thanks Mizanur Rahman. He could not be here, obviously, but I would also like to thank Kazi Orko Rahman, Dr. Kazi Orko Rahman. And if you need any data on him, please email me. I should be able to share. And of course, thanks to the department for organizing all that.
Thank you, Mohammad Zaki, for that wonderful talk. And again, remember when we talked about some of the refugee crises, and I would like to share, before I share the commentary, with one particular story regarding what that happened when I was doing my PhD. I was working, one of my duties was working as a writing studio consultant, and one of the students who kept on coming back to the writing studio, he could not speak English, of course, not his first language. And he had this one particular pencil, which was half broken. And throughout the semester, he came and he took notes, whatever I discussed regarding his project, with that one particular broken pencil. Okay. And he refused to use any other pen that we had to offer, any other writing instrument that we had to offer. It has to be that particular half broken pencil. And at a certain point, I became curious because it was taking time and I'm on appointment and we only have 30 minutes of schedule. And if I could not help him on that 30 minutes, I miss another student. And with his limited vocabulary of English, the only thing he could mutter during one time was that this is the last of home. Okay. So that pencil was one of the things that he made during one of his art projects, and he was a Syrian refugee, that he is the only thing that he could manage to bring when he came to the United States as a refugee. And that expression, like whatever he writes using that pencil, gives him the feeling that I'm creating something with this that is my root. And that is part of my identity. And whatever words I write, whatever things I craft, becomes more than that, becomes an act of resilience, because this is what I am. And this is what I am is the question that we're asking in this class is what exactly refugees are, because we all know that when we talk that how the refugee term itself can be a derogatory. And people might ask particular refugees that why aren't you grateful that you are getting shelter? You have seen the second camp, which looks the red building, much structured. So coming from a massacre, a genocide, the current body count of the refugee crisis since 2017 is over 800,000 deaths. Okay, the displacement is about 1.4 million. And it also gives you an idea, just out of curiosity, how many of you heard about the Rohingya crisis before this class? How many of you heard about the Rohingya refugee crisis before this class? Not many, I guess some, few, less than 50%, even by a positive assumption. So the Rohingya refugee crisis has been one of the largest refugee crises, as in part in terms of displacement casualty with the Syrian, Middle Eastern, and Ukrainian refugee crisis that is happening in the 21st century. 800,000 displaced, 500,000 almost dead, including rapes, murder. But the fact that it did not get that much media attention also shows us the hierarchy of the problems that we discussed in the class, that who gets media attention. One of the first talk when the Rohingya refugee crisis was coming to the forefront, one of the key scholars of the field even asked this question, that is it possible for this refugee to be true? And his justification was that it cannot be possible because the military crackdown on the Rohingyas was done by the Myanmar military, who are Buddhist, and the Rohingyas are predominantly Muslim population, and the Buddhist population cannot be violent. And the Muslim population will have to be the violent. Again, there are different radical sects in every particular religion, but it also shows us the assumption that we talked about Islamophobia, how different refugees are put into different brackets. And also, as Zaki's lecture has shown, why did the refugees feel this particular need? What is the word that you use, Jugad?
Yeah, Jugaad.
The Jugad, like why does the refugee population need the Jugad initiative to build something colorful when basic survival is at stake? And that is because it is one of the fundamental human characteristics. It is not about just food and shelter, as we have found countless times and times. Remember the Haitian refugee crisis that talked about Guantanamo Bay. The Haitian refugees said that we will not take this food because it does not give us the flavor that we feel at home. Basic protein is not enough. We need something flavorful because that shows us that we are human. Same with the art colorful. If you have followed Nat Geographic, if you go back, you have found that the earliest sign of human civilization anywhere is the cave painting. Okay, not anything else but the painting. So the artwork and the music are the first sign that human tried to commute to show the self-expression that we are something different. Here too, and I would like to tie this to the election before some of the position of the question. You mentioned, Zaki, that because it is on its first initial phase, the refugee are in comparison to Bangladeshi art. So, who do we say that the refugee artwork, the rickshaw artwork of the Rohingya camp is taking inspiration, not only taking inspiration from Bangladeshi rickshaw war, and then fusing it with whatever inspiration they find from their own home country and making it a hybrid. So the next phase of Rohingya art would be a fusion of what they found in Bangladesh with what they bring from Myanmar. Is that, can we say that it would be a fusion artwork?
Do you want me to talk about it now?
Yeah.
So that is actually the point of major research. So ideally, because we have a long history of studying refugee culture a lot, and in many cases, I actually found out that oftentimes we only look back to the cultural part, to the cultural root, or to the home, or to the fact of, to the essence of belongingness, right? And in this particular point, I noticed some sort of intercultural encounter between Bangladesh and Rohingya. And that was really quite promising because it tells us about perhaps maybe not necessarily the entirety of what's coming ahead, but at least to the point of what is really happening with these Rohingyas right now. Like they are getting, as you said, like they are learning the ways of the Bangladeshi people, or learning the ways of the host country, and also trying to actually bring back or bring whatever they had learned in their past life, and they're fusing them together. It's actually hybrid culture. And at this point, and there are a lot of ways you will find them perhaps maybe offering their own interpretation of Bangladeshi rickshaw art. In many ways, like perhaps, and one thing that I've noticed is actually in the design of the rickshaws. And when I was actually interviewing them, they were clearly suggesting that the one we have in Bangladesh is not really quite safe. The suspension is not really that good. And they were thinking of actually turning the rickshaws there on the island better. Like the suspension would be better, it will be more safe for the passengers. And if that's happening there with the manufacturing process, of course, when they were actually focusing on the creative ventures or creative approaches, they were, of course, thinking of what they can take and how they can actually make it more related or relevant to their own culture too.
Thank you. And this brings us, and this is one of the questions we got from the chat and related to our last week. So just a background, prior to coming here, just in the afternoon, we were supposed to have lunch to take Mr. Zaki give a taste of hard food per se in Faux Boston. Okay. And remember in last week, we talked about the cookbook that Dr. Pishot introduced, how different second generation Asian Americans take a spin on that Asian cooking to give their flavor. And one of the questions that we could not address in last class was that, can we consider tacos or pho's, okay, or ramen even that you'll have at the end of the class, American? Okay. With the election and everything, there is always a rhetoric regarding we have to make America to this original self. And what is the original self is the question. Like what makes something, that idea of purity. And this is both an original and dangerous concept, because purity, that something could be, culture especially, and artwork could be absolutely pure, is the rhetoric that started the Holocaust, okay, to find one pure race, okay, that would be free from contamination regarding everything. So just like this artwork shows, art, culture, and even food recipes are always in migration, always in contact. If a faux shop is named as faux, what is that? Faux Boston, that is a distinctly American shop. It does not have to be due with the faux or the food faux is not from America or a particular thing. We cannot make the argument that taco is not an American food. It is almost just as an American food as steak or burger. Okay, that is how things flow. The second question that we got, do you have any question in the class?
About the art, are there arts that are worth more, like how like they said they cost like $1 to write it, but then they make like $3 off food art? Are there some like artists like me that are worth more for their art?
Are you referring to the Bangladeshi ones or the Rohingya ones?
Are we
So are you referring to the 3D artworks or? All right. So for their ventures are not completely limited to the manufacturing of the rickshaw. They're not really doing anything outside of the rickshaw, at least for rickshaw art. All right. But in Bangladesh, so the paintings that you would find rickshaw artists making for the rickshaw, they cost really less because that's more like that's something they would have to do every day, literally every hour. And it's obviously because of the demand, right? If they start charging more, they would actually they would get perhaps maybe less request or less commission. But still, these artists would get a lot of requests by any average random people like us, like who would want a particular scene or a particular moment to be captured from the perspective of that artist. Those would actually cost more because the artist would be thinking just like the person who requested it. And like it's not necessarily from the artist's perspective, it's actually from the person who commissioned it from that person's perspective. So that difference is really quite important because again, I do personally, whenever it comes to rickshaw art, I don't really look at the commissioned works. I only look at the ones. I think that was one of the goals of the Rickshaw Art Archive that we had. Like we only try to focus on what's done, like organically, or it's not done really based on the usual tradition that we have at art institutions. Like everything needs to be commissioned, everything needs to be requested for the exhibition by the institution. We only look at the tradition that we have for rickshaw art. So I guess that answers your questions partly, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it also like as I would like to spend with the commissioner, let's say, if some art is worth greater, it can be if there is a story attached to it, and it gives you an idea regarding how things flow. In fact, is it possible to pull out the rickshaw archive on the archive?
Yeah.
So one thing I found recently that, like Zaki mentioned, that most of this artwork is done by almost blue-collar art painters who did not go to any professional art school. It is just a self-expression. And think about DUI or garage rap. Like most of the 90s music that came out of garage that was being commissioned had a different kind of expression. When Zaki created this archive, we and I acted as an advisor, but you did the bulk work. I'm taking credit here, but we found that when it started, the rickshaw painting in the 30s, 20s, and then due to colonization, the paintings traveled to even Japan, to England, and stuff like that. And then brands like top tier fashion brands like Hermes, Gucci, okay, some of them in Japan did a show where they had jackets and something high-end fashion with some of the rickshaw paint. Okay, so that is worth like a 700,000 jacket. Okay, but it took something that is down to resilient from a community without giving acknowledgement to who the artwork is, with a schoolwork, and then sold something differently. So there is another economic angle that we try to raise, is like acknowledge where are you getting these ideas of inspiration from. But as far as rickshaw goes, it is interesting because we have both brought in Bangladesh. With every time and change, you'll find that background placard of anything representing that particular time. Just like you find the t-shirts that we wore in the teenage years in our favorite band and stuff. And it takes inspiration from a myriad source. I once saw the rickshaw art that became very popular in Bangladesh. How many of you remember the show Breaking Bad? Yes. Breaking Bad. So we had, now Breaking Bad is a show that is known to Bangladesh in the urban community. Like who speaks English, who could watch that show because it's in English. And there was one rickshaw painting even in the urban chore where they had the Breaking Bad characters or Marvel characters. The people who do not know this product, but because of the how culture travels, they thought that this sounds interesting, this seems inspiring. In fact, maybe you can find, you see the first one?
That's the one.
You know, we have the Walter White, okay, and that. This is a show that is done in the Hollywood here, and that it traveled to one of the refugee camps in Bangladesh, and they make rickshaw there. Also shows how different ideas and inspiration travels all around. So another question that I got, any question from the audience here? Another question that I got from here, what does or how can, it's related to art in general, how can artwork or art style like the rickshaw do anything to change the life? I'm guessing probably there are to do for the refugees. Like, what can art do to bring any positive changes?
Not necessarily generally only rickshaw, right?
Yeah, not nothing.
So
Art in general.
I think you can probably remember that I was referring to some of the like international collaborations, artistic collaborations between Rohingya people and also international collaborations between Rohingya people and some other artists from all around the world. And these artistic collaborations were done intentionally and only so that the Rohingya people can find a way to express, find more ways, not just one way, more ways to actually express whatever they are experiencing. It can be perhaps maybe how they are looking back. It can be perhaps maybe how they are looking forward. It can be perhaps maybe entirely based on their traumatic experience they had overcome. So these artistic collaborations are obviously, because these are collaborations, you're getting a lot of different inputs from different organizations, but the purpose remains almost the same for all of these collaborations, like to find a space for the Rohingya people to at least do something that would allow them to incorporate or integrate whatever the artistic or creative expressions they had back home and do actually something really quite be part of their memory. So it's more like documenting the cultural memory or documenting the skills of the Rohingya people. That's one way, and this has become even for kids. Like I've seen actually collaborations between Rohingya kids with even, and that is one another project that we are undertaking in Bangladesh at Brack University. We're organizing actually a photography exhibition where both Rohingya photographers and Bangladeshi photographers will actually participate together. And the Bangladesh and the we have this theme for this particular exhibition titled "My Idea of Home." And of course, it makes sense because my idea of home in Bangladesh as a Bangladeshi would be completely different than what the Rohingyas would be actually experiencing, right? Their idea of home would be, if it is about actually the refugee camps, is going to be absolutely different than my idea of home. But we are connecting all of them together. We're using the shared space, we're using the shared knowledge, just so that we actually can look diverse ways how we can define home. And this is one venture that can help the Rohingya photographers to at least like share their opinion, like voice their opinion, and offer how differently. And I think Kazi did mention earlier that like how it is really quite possible that no one has literally almost half of you did not really hear about the Rohingya migration or Rohingya refugee crisis. And that's obviously because who gets to be prioritized. We have this hierarchy for what should be prioritized or who should be prioritized in the media. And these creative approaches, these artistic collaborations would definitely at least allow the artists to have some sort of voice established, and we get to know more about their culture, we get to know more about their skills, we get to know more about their history too.
Okay. And second, I understand it's the question is summarized the long stuff. So it asks regarding how come Bangladesh, which itself has been, itself came from a very violent war. In 71, Bangladesh gained independence, and in 71 there are 1 million Bangladeshi refugees who went to India. So the question is suggesting how come a country that only has a history of sending or delivering refugees 50 years back considers the Rohingya refugees as a kind of derogatory term. And I will speak to that and you can add to that. It also gives you an idea regarding how we always seem to think that there are only certain countries which keeps on producing refugees, and that is not true. Second, it becomes very, very easy to consider someone as subhuman just because we are living a comfortable lifestyle. And that has been same for my countrymen as well. The country, my father, my grandfather itself had been part of the refugees who had went to India in 71. Many of the Bangladesh, almost each family had one member who was a refugee in 1971. And within 50 years, when there was an influx of refugees from Myanmar coming in, then many of these countrymen who had the experience of being refugee also asked the question that we should not be accommodative of refugees because they are ruining the economy, they are taking up space, and this kind of stuff. Okay, so it helps us to understand that just because somebody has been a refugee, okay, does not automatically mean that they will be sympathetic to the refugee crisis, problem, issue throughout their life. Okay. And you can also understand when you talk about the humanitarian crisis or burden shrinking during the Europe. Europe faced the refugee crisis since World War I, World War II, and still now this idea about not taking Ukrainian refugees has been part of the problem even now. So that is the question. But we have 5 minutes left and stay. Do we have any one last question? Okay.
Yes, Cultural Memory Center.
There seem to be a lot of boats in there.
Yes.
And looking at some of the artwork, there's some decent blues, reds, flowers, but there was one that had boats on it. What's the?
There's just one particular side of the Cultural Memory Center. So Rohingyas, a lot of them are actually into the profession of fishing, or even actually in the development of boats. Like their boats, some of their boats would actually look significantly different than any other kind that you would find in Myanmar. Rohingyas are actually a different ethnic community you will find in Myanmar. Like their ways of life would be a lot different than any other like Burmese people you will find. These boards, they do actually, like even the craftsmanship of those boards, right? They do actually represent their documentation of their profession, their everyday life. And of course, it does also indicate that perhaps maybe how they are quite closely related to the natural resources. And even I think if you make a comparison between boards you'll find in Bangladesh and boards that are made by Rohingyas, you'll clearly understand each would have different opinion about natural resources. Like the Rohingyas one, I think they are beautifully decorated. But when I compare them to the Bangladeshi one, I would find Bangladeshi one to be a bit more pragmatic, like a bit more into how quickly you can actually gather resources. So these boards that you see, they do also tell you about the core philosophy of the Rohingya people. I think even in any other migrations, you'll actually find the same idea. Like, now, even if you think about the multicultural society in the US, like all these different philosophical values that we have here in the US, they're actually not necessarily born here. A lot of the elements you'll find there here would be actually brought by maybe someone 300 years ago, 200 years ago during their own migration.
Any other? All right. Thank you all. Please give a big hand for Zaki.